never thought that an ordinary trip home could turn into a nightmare. It happened last month when I was returning from work late at night. I work in a small marketing company downtown. Usually, I finish work at 6, but this time my boss asked me to stay until 9. Tired and exhausted, I left the office and headed to the bus stop. The city was already falling asleep. The streets were almost empty, and only a few cars drove by. When I reached the stop, the bus was just leaving, and I realized I would have to wait for the next one for half an hour. I decided to walk a few blocks, hoping to find a taxi. As I walked, I noticed a man following me. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, but when I turned the corner and saw him again, a sense of unease washed over me. He looked ordinary, average height in a dark coat and hat. His face was hidden in the shadow, but I felt that he was closely watching me. I quickened my pace, but the man did not fall behind. I began to recall all those horror movies where the main character tries to escape from a stalker, and realized that my situation was resembling one of them. Trying not to panic, I decided to turn into the nearest store to see if this was really a pursuit or just my imagination. Entering a small grocery store, I stopped by the shelves and pretended to choose something. A few minutes later, I saw the man walk past the window and stop at the entrance, scanning the room. My heart began to beat faster. This was a real pursuit. I exited the store through another door and ran towards the nearest police station. Unfortunately, it was a few blocks away, and I didn't know if I could reach it safely. The streets seemed empty and cold, and I felt that every step echoed in the silence of the night. Finally, I saw the light of the station and breathed a sigh of relief. But as I got closer, horror engulfed me. The doors were locked, and no one was inside. I began banging on the door, trying to attract someone's attention, but only silence responded. Suddenly, I felt someone touch my shoulder. I turned around and saw the same man. He was standing too close, and I could see his face. His eyes were cold and empty, like a doll's, and a sinister smile stretched across his face. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to hide my fear. "Just to talk," he replied in an unexpectedly soft voice. "I don't know you. Stay away from me." "Oh, but you do know me," he said, and his smile widened even more. I didn't listen to him any further and ran towards the nearest residential area. I didn't know where exactly I was running, but my intuition told me to stay away from this man. It felt like I was running forever until I finally saw the light in a house window. I ran up to the door and started knocking, shouting for help. An elderly man opened the door. "What happened?" he asked, looking me over from head to toe. "Help me. Some man is chasing me," I blurted out. The elderly man let me into the house and locked the door with a bolt. I barely had time to catch my breath when I heard a knock on the door. We both fell silent and looked at the door in horror. "Who is it?" the old man asked, but no one answered. He looked through the peephole and recoiled. "Is it him?" he asked me, and I nodded. The old man pulled out his phone and dialed the police, but there was no response. Maybe the line was busy or something else had happened. It felt like the world had gone mad. "Hide in the basement," he said, opening the door to the basement. "I'll try to stall him." I went down the stairs and closed the door behind me. In the darkness of the basement, I could hear the old man arguing with the stalker. My mind was tense with fear and anticipation. Suddenly, everything went quiet, and I knew something was wrong. A few minutes later, the basement door slowly opened, and I saw the man's silhouette. It was him. His face was covered in blood, and he was holding a knife. "Time to talk," he said, and his voice sounded like a sentence. I rushed to the window, trying to find an escape, but it was locked. The man was getting closer, and I could feel my heart beating in time with his steps. I knew this was the end. Suddenly, I heard police sirens. The man stopped and turned his head toward the sound. This moment gave me a chance. I grabbed everything I could and threw it at him. He staggered and fell, and I took advantage of the moment and ran out of the basement. The police were already near the house. I ran to them, shouting for help. They grabbed me and calmed me down, assuring me that everything would be all right. The stalker was arrested. It turned out that he was a serial killer who had been stalking his victims all over the city. I was lucky to be alive. But this incident left a permanent mark on my soul. Now I always look over my shoulder when I walk down the street, and I never go out late at night without a reason. It was a horrifying ordeal that taught me to be careful and appreciate every moment of life. But sometimes when I fall asleep, I dream of his face and I wake up again in a cold sweat, reminding myself that nightmares sometimes become reality. When I arrived in the small town of Graceville in the USA, I hoped to find a quiet place to escape the city noise and spend a few weeks in peace. The town was perfect: old houses, friendly residents, and picturesque landscapes. However, my hopes for a peaceful vacation quickly faded when I noticed someone was following me. At first, it seemed like paranoia. Imagining that someone was watching me, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But soon I noticed that a stranger in a black coat and hat was always nearby, no matter where I went. One evening, I decided to test my suspicions. I deliberately took a few extra steps and changed my route to see if the stranger would continue to follow me. And he did. I turned, changed directions, walked through shaded alleys, but he always stayed on my tail. Now I was certain someone was stalking me. The next day, I decided to contact the local police. They listened to my story, but their skepticism was evident. They advised me to relax and enjoy the vacation. But I couldn't. I felt like my life was in danger. I began to fear going outside, so I spent more time in my hotel room. But even there, I didn't feel safe. One evening, I heard a rustling sound outside my door. When I approached it, the noise stopped. I opened the door and saw that the corridor was empty, but on the floor lay a note. "I'm always nearby." That was the last straw. I decided to leave Graceville and return home. After packing my things, I headed to the train station, but on the way I felt someone watching me. I quickened my pace, but the stalker also quickened his. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced down the street, hoping to find a safe place. Finally, I saw a small cafe and rushed inside, hoping to lose myself among the people. But when I turned around, I saw him. He was standing at the entrance, watching me. I couldn't take this terror any longer. I approached the bartender and told him about my problem. He advised me to stay in the cafe until closing time, and then he could help me get to the station. I agreed and tried to calm down, sitting at a corner table. When the cafe closed, the bartender and a few other workers helped me get to the backyard. We quietly walked down the street, hoping to avoid the stalker. But when we approached the station, I saw him again. He was standing in the shadows watching us. I boarded the train and felt I could finally breathe. But even on the train, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I arrived home, I locked myself in my house, trying to forget this horrific experience. But nothing changed. Every time I left the house, I felt his presence. One day, I received another note. "You can't escape from me." I couldn't live in constant fear any longer. I decided to hire a private detective, hoping he could find this stalker and end this nightmare. The detective listened to my story attentively and promised to help. He spent a few days watching my house but found nothing suspicious. He advised me to install surveillance cameras and continue monitoring. Weeks passed, but the stalker didn't appear. I began to think it was over, but deep down I knew he was still out there. One evening, I decided to review the camera footage and saw him. He was standing near my house watching me through the window. I didn't know what to do next. My fear turned into panic. I decided to contact the police again, but this time they took my words more seriously. They started an investigation, but the stalker vanished without a trace. Now I live in constant fear that he will return. Every noise at the door, every unfamiliar glance on the street makes me shudder. I don't know who he is or why he chose me as his victim. But I know one thing. This nightmare isn't over. I live in constant fear that one day he will return and my story will have a tragic ending. When I moved to this town, it seemed perfect. Quiet, peaceful, with friendly neighbors and clean streets. But the sense of safety quickly dissipated when I noticed someone watching me. It all started a few months ago when I first saw him. It was during an evening walk with my dog. The man stood under a tree on the opposite side of the road. I didn't pay much attention to it, thinking he was just taking a walk. But the next day he was there again, and again. He was always there whenever I went for a walk. At first I tried to ignore it, but every time I went for a walk or to the store, he was always somewhere nearby. He never came close, never said anything, just watched me. One day, as I was walking home from work, I felt someone following me. Turning around, I saw him. He was walking at a distance, but close enough for me to make out his features. I quickened my pace, trying to get home as fast as possible. He quickened his pace too. This went on for several weeks. I started feeling constant fear and anxiety. I couldn't sleep, always listening for every noise outside the window. One evening, I decided to call the police. The officers arrived quickly, but found nothing. They said they would patrol the area, but couldn't promise anything concrete. I felt helpless. One day, I decided to leave town for a few days to rest and regain my strength. I went to a friend's house in another city, hoping it would help me calm down. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I returned home, I realized my feeling wasn't wrong. In the evenings, I began to hear strange noises outside the window, as if someone was standing there and watching. One time, gathering my courage, I decided to approach the window and look. But when I opened the curtains, no one was there. My paranoia grew with each passing day. I started closing all the curtains and doors, not leaving the house unless absolutely necessary. But he still found ways to be near. One evening, coming home, I saw a note on the door. "I know where you live." This was the last straw. I called the police again, but they only said they could send a patrol. I felt like no one understood me and couldn't help. Then I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed surveillance cameras around the house and set a trap. One evening, when I heard strange noises again, I decided to check the cameras. On one of the recordings, I saw him. He was standing by my window, looking inside. His face was contorted in a grimace. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a stick, I ran outside, ready for a confrontation. But he was gone. It seemed like he knew my every move in advance. The next morning, I decided I needed to tell someone about this. I turned to my neighbor, who was a retired police officer. He agreed to help and advised me to contact a private detective. The detective arrived a few days later and began his investigation. It turned out that my stalker was a former neighbor I only knew superficially. He had mental health issues and had been in similar situations before. The detective gathered all the evidence and handed it over to the police. My stalker was detained and sent to a psychiatric hospital. I was advised to change my place of residence. It wasn't easy, but I moved to another city. It seemed like everything was over. But even now, when I walk down the street, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. I always turn around, listen to every rustle, because I know the stalker could appear again. Life has taught me to be cautious and trust no one. And even though the stalker is no longer around, his shadow always stays with me.